bright light.
Yeah, it's bright. Nice crowd, a lot of people. What is hard for me are these wide rooms because I always want to look at my audience and I sit there like this. Very irritating. So this, of course, is a year of many panels on stages. Usually they stand and it's all red and blue and white and they have ties. I promise we will not talk about policies. We'll not talk about the size of our hands. It will be very civilized. Tim introduced us. Linus is the reason we're all here. I'm the reason why we get Linus to be here, so this all works out for us.
Yeah, I don't do speaking engagements anymore, so.
Yeah. San Diego. We've been here for LinuxCon. We're trying to figure out how many years ago that was. This hotel is nicer.
Yeah.
The last time we were at the airport Sheraton for the locals. The diving last time was fun with a little nippy, so I think this is overall an improvement. But let's talk about stuff the audience actually cares about. Linux 4.6 RC2 came out Sunday morning before we went to the airport.
Yeah.
Huge merge window, a ton of changes, and a very quiet RC2. Can you talk about highlights, lowlights? Where are we?
Well, I mean, we've actually had, this particular release of 4.2 seems to be larger than they've been for a couple of years now. But at the same time, we've kind of reached a fairly stable plateau where it fluctuates a bit. And I think it's largely related to how our code flow works, just how much code can you accept in a release. I'm happy to say that there's nothing hugely revolutionary in 4.2. We've gone past that stage where we rewrite whole subsystems. We do have yet another file system, so now I think we're up to 35 different file systems. This one is distributed cluster file system, so maybe the IoT people are not so much into that kind of file system. But it's been, for the last 5 years, I think, we've had a fairly stable model of development where we try to continually improve on things. Things do grow, which not everybody in this audience is going to be happy with. But the thing I am very happy about in the development is how alive all the different subsystems are. And we're continually improving, not just in the new areas, but we're actually continuing to improve even in the very core stuff that you'd expect that after 25 years you'd gotten right. But it turns out, even after 25 years, there are things you can improve even in low-level code.
So I noticed the code name is still Blurry Fishbutt, and you didn't even take pictures on this trip. So
yeah, the code names, I've started to kind of give up on them. They have no meaning. They never have had any meaning. If there's a particularly good release that I really feel strongly about, I will call it something Weasel, because that's just a history of good kernels where weasels, but there has to be something special about them. The kernel code names never actually show up anywhere except in the kernel sources.
So you mentioned the 25 years. It is indeed 25 years this year, and that, of course, will get you exposed to a lot of reminiscing by people. But I mean, seriously, at which point in these 25 years did you assume that you would use your Linux phone to connect through Linux-based routers to a high-powered Linux-based data center when AI helps you pick which Linux-based device to buy next?
You know what? It didn't happen overnight, so there's no single point where I was surprised, really. I mean, the surprising hardware is from 15 years ago when people started using Linux. I mean, when I started doing this, I saw it as a workstation because I want to have a desktop. I wanted to have a traditional workstation for myself. And the transition then to servers was very natural because of the whole Unix connection. I mean, that was not a big surprise. But about 15 years ago, or slightly longer, we started seeing these odd, and no offense, these odd embedded uses. So the first one I remember is a gas pump that was running Linux because people wanted to show, I mean, you guys know all about this. They want to monetize their gas pumps by showing commercials on them, right? And it was running Linux, and that made me go, whoa. But then everything else, all the other Linux uses have been very gradual, and a lot of them have been completely invisible, like Tim was mentioning, that there's a lot of Linux uses that even I don't at all see and I'm not aware of.
So you weren't surprised about the ever bigger servers? In a way, the phones and tablets were kind of a natural development once the embedded things started.
Yep.
The failure on the desktop, since you started with the workstation, since that was...
Failure is such an ugly word.
Failure is an appropriate word.
So the desktop hasn't really taken over the world like Linux has in many other areas. But just looking at my own use, my desktop looks so much better than I ever could have imagined. Despite the fact that I'm known for sometimes not being very polite to some of the desktop UI people because I want to get my work done, pretty is not my primary thing. I actually am very happy with the Linux desktop, and I started the project for my own needs, and my needs are very much fulfilled. So that's why, to me, it's not a failure. I would obviously love for Linux to take over that world too, but it turns out it's a really hard area to enter. So I'm still working on it. It's been 25 years. I can do this for another 25. I'll wear them down.
Okay. So I actually have spoken at ELC a few times. I think this is your first time on stage at ELC.
Yeah.
Of course, it's the IoT Summit now, Open IoT Summit. So after the Internet of Not Things, we finally graduated to the Internet of Things. Awesome. How important do you think is Linux for the Internet of Things? I mean, wouldn't a smaller OS, something that doesn't have as much, I mean, you said yourself, it keeps growing,
right,
doesn't have as much baggage, doesn't have as much attack surface from a security point of view, wouldn't a smaller OS maybe be better for IoT?
There's no question that, I mean, if you are looking at small sensors, they already are not necessarily running Linux, and they probably will never run Linux, because when you're doing something really tiny, you don't need Linux. I think Linux is convenient even in smaller spaces than you necessarily need Linux, just because it's the development platform and just the infrastructure you get. But I suspect most people who are interested in Linux in the IoT space are interested in this either slightly big, I mean, there's a lot of big embedded stuff, yes, but there's also, you need a lot of smart devices, especially when you have, how many standards did you say we have now? 23, and working on the 24th. So if you have all these stupid devices that don't necessarily run Linux, and they all talk slightly different standards, you will need a lot of smart devices to make it all look fairly unified. So maybe you won't see Linux at the very leaf nodes, but anytime you have a hub in your house, and I suspect most of us have at least one, and probably more than one hub, at that point, you need something like Linux.
Have you looked at any of the micro RTOSes, things like Zephyr or ECOS, FreeRTOS?
I've never actually been very interested in the really small operating systems. To me, it was also always exciting to, I mean, part of the reason I started Linux was I was excited about interacting with hardware. So if it doesn't have a memory management unit, to me, it's not interesting. The fact that you actually can make Linux run on those, I find very impressive in a kind of scary way. But But to me, as a software person who's interested in hardware, I kind of expect more from hardware. So I've never looked at the really small operating systems that people use for hardware that is just too stupid to run Linux.
I love the kernels that have a memory footprint of 817 bytes.
Yeah.
And I always wonder how, what the services are they might offer. But let's switch gear for a moment. Deep inside, everyone who knows you knows that you are a hardcore security person. Okay, there are some people here who know you, that's good. Bruce Schneier has written a lot of interesting stuff about the IoT space, about deeply embedded. And the one term that he keeps bringing up is that IoT is unpatchable.
Yep.
So the fact that you have billions of devices running, old Linux kernels with known exploits, is this a concern? Is this something you worry about?
I don't worry about it because there's not a lot we can do. I mean, as you say, it is unpatchable. It's a fact of life. It's something we should worry about in the sense that we should make sure it doesn't keep on happening, right? And at the same time, one of the reasons I'm famous for not always agreeing with the security people is that security to me is always secondary. The primary job is always get the job done. If you don't get the job done, who cares about security anymore? Because that piece of hardware will not be used.
This is the most secure tablet device you've ever seen.
So,
try hack this.
So one of the issues is when you have a new industry that does new and crazy things, of course they will get things wrong because they will concentrate on just getting functionality, and security is always going to be playing second fiddle to functionality. I think we're getting to the point where now people are finally looking at security, which is really, really good. And will we ever be perfectly secure? No. Is it slightly distressing that there will be billions and billions of devices that are going to be open to security problems? It's slightly distressing. I have smart appliances in my home. If somebody hacks into my home and makes my furnace go crazy, and I wake up and it's 95 degrees, and I feel really stupid, but at the same time, many of these devices, it's not the end of the world.
My furnace is not internet connected, and it has done that to me without any help from hackers.
Yeah, so bugs happen even without the security problems. Yeah. But so I think what I want to say is it's something we should keep in mind, and it is something that as the tools and platforms become more mainstream, I think we will fix. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I do want to, again, stress that security in a first implementation is very seldom going to be there for very fundamental reasons.
But I think what you're saying is exactly right, in that very often, at first, it doesn't work. At first, it's not there. So the ability to upgrade, the ability to apply patches, that I think is a much bigger part of security than getting it perfectly right the first time. And that is one of those questions that brings up the difference between the beautiful walled gardens and what we do in open source. So if you have an original iPad, then the last version that of iOS you can use is 5.1 with all its glorious security holes, and you cannot upgrade. There is no path. Versus in an open source world, at least in theory.
In theory, that's a big thing, though.
Yeah, so
in practice, it's not. Quite often, we end up having hardware manufacturers who make it impossible in practice. But even in the absence of actual lockdown, which does have security advantages too, even in the absence of actual lockdown, we do end up finding that we have bit rot, where old devices are just not getting the kind of loving they would perhaps deserve because they're not as exciting anymore. And so the technical people have moved on to the new shiny thing, the latest and greatest, So they don't find it sexy, and the support people are often of the opinion that, okay, we don't sell these anymore, so we just want to make sure it doesn't look too bad for our company. So quite often, even with open source, you end up not necessarily being able to upgrade.
Well, so it's the not being able to upgrade, in a way, has two components to it. It has, is there an upgrade available for a vendor? Is the vendor still around? Do they care? Do they have, I mean, how many Android phones are out there that no longer get upgrades? Yet things like Cyanogen then provide open source builds for them. And I could certainly envision in a world that is based around an open source code base, that this could be possible for even more devices, especially if the vendors figure out a better way to separate what is their value add, what is the thing that the Nest thermostat does that is special, versus what is the underlying OS, and allow a way for the user to upgrade those.
I would absolutely. I mean, one of the issues I end up personally having with a lot of the embedded vendors ends up being that a lot of it is one-off hardware. Sometimes the hardware has a turnaround time, especially if you make things in China. You can turn around a whole platform in weeks, right? And you build a specific distribution for that piece of hardware. And quite often it contains drivers that are not open source or other infrastructure that is not open source. And then you sell it, and 6 months later you sell the next version. And this is very frustrating to me as a kernel maintainer, because at no point in the embedded world did those people push their improvements back to me, because they didn't have the time to do that, really. And they didn't have the time to interact with the kernel community, which, I mean, A, we are busy people, but B, we have issues like maintainability and quality control that the people who are churning out a new device don't have, right? So the embedded world has traditionally been a hard world to just interact with as an open source developer. I think that's improving, and part of it why it seems to be improving is that even the embedded world is seeing a lot of consolidation on the hardware side, where it turns out it's cheaper to buy a chip that is more than you really need, but because it's made in billions and billions, it costs less than the custom thing that is just exactly what you want. And I think especially the ARM community has started to become so much better. I mean, this issue still exists, don't get me wrong, but we're in the situation where by now, as kernel people, we can actually catch up, or at least keep up with some of these hardware improvements, which in the embedded world has traditionally not been the case. So it's actually improving. We're not nearly there yet.
And there's another side to this whole walled garden versus everything is open distinction, and that is, if you have a walled garden, if you have very tight control by one vendor or a couple of vendors, you have what turns into a monoculture, which makes you the ideal target for people who want to hack you. I mean, there has always been this arrogance amongst the Linux users that there are no viruses for Linux. And the simple answer is, it was so much more profitable for the bad guys to target Windows. Not because the code necessarily was worse. Initially, it may have been. Today, I don't think it is much worse than our code. But you have hundreds of millions of devices out there that run exactly the same code. And so trying to do tricky stack-based attacks where you need to know exactly which binary is running makes a lot more sense in these environments. But this whole walled garden thing has another aspect, and that's the whole interoperability, interconnectivity of devices. Like Apple, don't like Apple, the devices in their ecosystem interoperate with each other beautifully. And Mike Richmond is going to talk next after us from the Open Connectivity Foundation, and he's going to talk about how we can create interoperability like this in the open. Is that a topic where you think open can actually help us?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that it's often easier to enter the market if you have a closed market because you control every piece, right? And then that's why you obviously end up often having these monopolies. But it's very bad for users. I mean, it's just bad for the consumer who wants to mix and match. And you have your Apples, you have your Nests, you have the All-Seen people, you have all these other standards. In many ways, I think the final answer is you will have all these smart hubs that just make sure they translate from standard to standard. I mean, right now it looks like, I mean, you have Amazon pushing that with Alexa, right? And I don't think we'll ever have a completely open standard that the one ring to rule them all. But it's one of those things that you will have 3 or 4 major different protocols, and people will just have to accept that that's the case, and then you will have to have a common point that tries to tie the 3, 4 together.
I look at something like TCP/IP. I mean, I remember, I'm old, token ring and other concepts in this area, and they all disappeared, and now every device speaks, in this class of devices, speaks TCP/IP, and it was an open standard, and it was something that was pushed very much against the desires of the IBMs of that time that wanted their proprietary standard to win. And I had the joy of having an AIX workstation that had both token ring and Ethernet connected. Yes, that was awesome and so useful. But do you think we will see something as fundamentally
I don't
global?
think we'll see something quite that fundamental. I mean, yes, TCP is a great example of something where everybody really standardized around the same thing. But even then, you ended up having IPv6, and you had the fast starts and small details that not everybody supports. But if you look at things like network file systems, we ended up not with one single standard.
Of course, NFS,
we
everyone
ended
uses
up
NFS.
with several different standards. And I think that's the more common situation. And I'd love for there to be just one protocol that everybody talks. And maybe that will actually work out. I certainly hope it will work out.
Okay, Mike,
don't think that's
AR. So let's switch gears a little bit. IoT, embedded space. Let's assume you weren't that kernel dude. What would you do in this space? What would be fascinating to you? Are you a maker? Would you build things? What interests you?
I'd love to be able to build things, but I have 2 left hands.
I've seen the video of your race car.
I've destroyed things with a soldering iron many times. So I'm not really set out to do hardware. I do think, I mean, I'm just looking at all the cool toys that I would love to have had available to me when I was a teenager and I was playing around with computers, and all these embedded boards that you can buy, whether it's a Raspberry Pi or BeagleBone or a Minnow board or anything like that, right? And there's tons of them. And if I wasn't doing kernels, I would probably be playing around with them. And the great part is if you aren't great at soldering and you end up destroying a couple, you can just buy a new one because, right.
So your daughters are almost off to college, well, 3 more years. Any plans for a second career? I don't think it's going to be Dive Master.
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, I really had been doing Linux for 25 years, and it's really interesting. I don't actually do coding anymore, as people hopefully know. That all I do is I end up overseeing and doing pull requests and shouting at people when the pull requests don't work.
You sent me patches yesterday.
Yeah, I don't think the dive log software is going to be a second career. It's it's not something I see really not doing. I mean, the kernel has maybe reached the point where I'm not the only one who could do the maintenance, but at the same time, I know a lot of the people. I love interacting with people over email mainly. Sometimes in person, I'm not so good. And it's just something I don't see not doing. When I start getting old and Alzheimer's strikes, at that point, somebody needs to kick me off the maintainership post. But for now, I'm very happy doing it.
So I'm a little worried. My next question was going to be, what would you make stop working on Linux? And since we already touched on Alzheimer's and us removing you by force, I'm a little worried about asking you that.
No, I'd be honestly very bored if I didn't have a project like Linux. I've done other projects. I started Git, and that was really fun I only did it for 3 months. I mean, so I'm famous as the guy who started Git. My daughter went off to college. My oldest daughter went off to college last fall. And she, at some point after a month, emailed me and said, oh, people know you as the author of Git. And like she had college people who had never in their lives used Linux, but they used Git and were blown away by the fact that my daughter was the daughter of the author of Git, right? I did Git for 3 months, and then Junio Hamano, who's been a great maintainer for over 10 years, has been the actual maintainer of Git, and I'm still known as the author of Git, right? I love doing user space for 3 months because user space is so easy. And if something goes wrong, you get a segmentation fault, you fire up the debugger and oh, that's easy. This is fun. It's like a vacation. But at the same time, after 3 months, it's like, okay, it's like sitting on a beach, sipping a pina colada. It's fun, but you can't spend your life doing that. You need some meat to your
Should we
life.
take a vote on that one?
So I don't really, I still really like low-level code. I like seeing patches that involve assembler being rewritten as C, finally, after 25 years. I really like that kind of real meat, technology at its lowest level. So I don't see myself giving up Linux.
So you mentioned Git. 4.5 years ago, you started your third project.
You were really trying to push this dialogue software.
No. There's my question was going to be number 4.
Oh, is there a number 4?
Is there a number 4? The Linus email client. The world needs
I'm
another
not going
web
to
browser.
say that there's never going to be a number 4, because someday something will irritate me and I will say, why does this not exist? And why are people so stupid that they can't write the right so-and-so, right? And then I will, in my arrogance, I will say, nobody else has been able to do it, so I'll do it in 2 weeks. And maybe that will happen. That's how Git came about.
I look forward to the UI toolkit written by you.
Yeah.
That would be just awesome. Sorry.
It's going to be a very capable toolkit.
We're almost out of time, and of course, whenever we do these presentations, the one thing I am asked to ask you is so, and we're going to change it this time because I always want to keep this fresh. You get to pick the unit, okay? Stay with me. You get to pick the unit. Where will Linux be in 24, years, months, weeks, days, hours?
Yeah.
You get minutes? Oh.
Minutes.
These IoT people
I
make me
actually
nervous.
have a plan for 24 minutes. I always say that I don't know where Linux will be. The only thing I care about is that I will make sure we do the best thing we can that day, right? And if you take care of the details, I think the big picture follows. There was not a lot of planning involved in Linux to begin with. There really hasn't been a lot of planning involved ever. And that should really blow people's mind, how little planning there was. And then you look at, I'm not saying the end result as the kernel. I'm saying even things like our code flow and how we do development. There was very little planning. There was no person, certainly not me, that says, now we need to have maintainership of this area, and you need to spread out and do this collaboratively over people. It happened naturally. And so I don't make 5-year plans. And I think trying to make 5-year plans is a fool's errand because you don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. My planning tends to be, I know what's going on this merge window, I see what's coming the next one, and then sometimes when making like decisions, people ask me, so should we do A or B? I kind of have a longer range plan. Okay, I know what hardware is coming out 2 years from now. So I kind of have that kind of plan, but not a lot of details. And I think it's been part of what's been great about Linux is that the fact that I haven't had a vision, and very few people have vision. I take that back. Lots of people have visions, but they're completely different. So people know where they want to drive Linux, but there's no coherent plan. And it's actually, I think, what made Linux be a fairly well-balanced system, because there was nobody who said, this is the direction, and we're going that direction, whether it's right or wrong. And we just spread out and did a little bit of everything.
Okay, our time shows 0 because the nice people in the back turned off the You're Over Time counter. I think we're done. Thank you very much, Linus. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Have a great conference.